Well, a big theme of this right now in the whole movement, but in particular at this event, is kind of this act local kind of idea, right? And so there was a lot of that going beyond dialogue, because a lot of people think this movement is about dialogue, like, oh, we're going to talk to each other, and won't that be wonderful? Then we'll go back and do the things we always do. So a lot of this is organizations and activities that are happening out there where they're going beyond dialogue into action. Like, I would not be surprised wherever you live that there's something like that going on in your community, and so you can find people that disagree on a lot of things and are different places on the political spectrum and all that kind of thing out there working on some shared problem together. They typically select places that have a really big divide right now. Maybe it's even gone so far as there's been violence around political violence or something like that, right? So they're very divided areas. So they go in and they first do all this connection work. So they first find people in that area that are already, sort of connected in that area, and so then they get associated with them and they learn that area, like what's that area going through and what are their challenges, and then they will assemble, a group of people across various spectrums, age and politics and other things, and then they'll try to come up with something to do, and that's the hard part, right? So agreeing on what to do. So they go through this whole effort. They have a whole process that takes months. You don't go in for a weekend and do one workshop. How would a Supreme Court, the judicial branch and the executive branch, I had an expert on, a scholar, a constitutional scholar, about that, talking about, if it comes to head, this is sort of new territory for us. And their phrase was sort of like, this would be like two suns colliding if the judicial branch and the executive branch actually sort of go toe to toe at some point. And I think this is something that John Roberts is really working to avoid, right? All these democratic things are really, sort of based on trust. They're based on you complying with it, right? Yeah. So, like if the Supreme Court's, we trust the Supreme Court unless we think they're a bunch of hacks. We trust that. Exactly. And it's just, and what happens then is it can all kind of spiral out of control if everyone sort of stops believing in that these things are what they were sort of philosophically laid down to be. There are issues where there's like insane approval, right? I mean, it's like there's 60-70% approval, which is, like you said, kind of ridiculous. We don't see that in elections very often. And we don't really go after that and like, okay, let's do that. The American people tell us this is like 70% approval. Why aren't we doing that? But we can't. Those politicians can't, because it's maybe not acceptable in their ideology, in their ideological sphere.
In this episode, I sat down with David Beckemeyer, host of the Outrage Overload podcast, to talk about the work he's been doing since the election. We started off by talking about how the bridge building movement is evolving. What started as efforts by various grassroots organizations to foster dialogue and listening is now expanding into local action. We discussed some of the major initiatives that are leading this push. The conversation went on to explore some of the major themes that David has been focused on over the past year on his own show, including fostering a deeper understanding of how democratic institutions work and promoting what he called democratic resilience, the idea that in a democracy, we won't always win, and how we respond to that matters. Along the way, we unpacked some of the forces driving polarization and talked about what it might take to build a healthier civic culture in today's political climate. This is our second conversation with David. Our first was in September of last year, and we received a lot of positive feedback on that episode. So I was excited to talk to him again to see how his thinking had evolved. Excerpts from our first conversation, titled Outrage and Empathy, are featured in our inaugural collection of essays and interviews, Life in the Scroll Age, available in both digital and print. If you'd like to check that out and support our work, you can find more info on our website by navigating to the collections page from the homepage. You can also find the link in the description here. We greatly appreciate your interest. And if you'd like to stay up to date on our content and events, definitely follow us on social media or subscribe to the newsletter, whatever is most convenient for you. Thank you again for your time, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. You were just mentioning before we got on that you went to this thing called the Bridging Summit, something of that nature, which is. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? What was that like, and what did you learn from talking to all the people there?
Yeah, so it's run by the Listen First Project, which you may be aware of their work, and Carissa Raskin is CEO there, and so they have been doing these virtually, like for quite a while, and this was the first in-person one, and they do a monthly meeting as well, but to do an in-person one, I thought was a great opportunity to go meet some of these folks in real life and just kind of share physical space with them and that kind of thing. And so that's what we did. And I think there was I don't know the exact final numbers, but it was something like 80 organizations represented, I think, and somewhere around 100 people or something like that, maybe even more, um, representing those organizations. I represented sort of two organizations, so I went to representing the Outrage Overload platform, media platform brand, as well as Crossing Party Lines, which is another sort of dialogue, sort of basically listen circles, you could almost call them, right? We're trying to share viewpoints and listen to others' viewpoints more than anything, or giving everybody an opportunity to share their viewpoints. So I went representing both of those. And so there's a lot of organizations like, More in Common and Bridge, Bridge. Everybody has a name like Bridge something, Bridge USA, and that's something we actually talked about a bit at that summit. So anyway, so at the summit, and one evening there was it was hosted at George Washington's Mount Vernon, which is, I didn't know this, but it's actually not a government owned thing. It's owned by, I want to say, like the Virginia Women's League or something like that. I'm not quite getting that right, but it's basically owned by an independent nonprofit. And so they put on talks kind of like the Commonwealth Club does and things like that. So as part of that, this Listen First movement was one of the talks. And so it was a panel of various folks. And at that panel, that day was open to the general public. And because they have they're a popular organization there, what you had is people that knew what it was about, kind of, because it was on their sort of list of different events, but it was just one of many events at that facility and with that organization. So you had people that weren't necessarily sort of in the know on this kind of bridging movement and all that. So I got to talk to as many I talked to as many people as I could there to kind of just get a sense of like what are ordinary people that aren't necessarily deep in this movement. What's the language that they use even talking about it, and what are the concerns that they have and things like that. So I loved that part as much as anything. But it was also nice to see all these people that I only know as a thumbnail, as a Zoom thumbnail in real life, and get a chance to actually interact in the real world. And it's like you meet someone that you know really well from sort of their Zoom chat, and then you see them in
Yeah.
real life and go, I had no idea you were that short.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You kind of imagine them and then you see the real version. Yeah. That's very cool. So what did you learn? Like what was the focus area for this year's discussion? Listen first, great name, one of the harder things to do in life, right? What yeah, what was the focus area? What were some of the insights that came out of it through your discussions?
Well, a big theme of this right now in the whole movement, but in particular at this event, is kind of this act local kind of idea, right? And so there was a lot of that, going beyond dialogue, because a lot of people think this movement is about dialogue, like, oh, we're going to talk to each other, and won't that be wonderful? Then we'll go back and do the things we always do. So a lot of this is organizations and activities that are happening out there where they're going beyond dialogue into action. And so a lot of that was the theme. And it was what's really nice about being involved in this movement, both at that conference and in general, is that seeing that all this is happening, because it doesn't get a lot of press. Like we don't see these kind of good news stories in our feeds very much, right? It's all the kind of exciting stuff and yeah, and the sort of the bad news stuff.
Yeah.
And when there's a big difference, you're going to see that. But when there's people getting along, or at least working together to get something done, you don't see that as much. So it's really been cool to see how much of that's happening. Like I would not be surprised wherever you live that there's something like that going on in your community. And so you can find people that disagree on a lot of things and are different places on the political spectrum and all that kind of thing out there working on some shared problem together. So it's great to see all that. So that was a big focus of it. A lot of the work being done like that. And then and talking about how, and in your mind you can think, well, that's one little thing. I did this thing and in my town, big deal. But I mean, if we're all doing that, that's collectively really makes a difference, right? And I call, I've been talking about this idea of civic muscle, that those little acts, when you now do have a conflict to deal with, you've got some experience like working alongside these people with these different views. So it's kind of changed your mental picture of what they look like instead of the caricature cartoon that were kind of given by the media and politicians too. We have this sort of a more real picture. I can actually identify these people that I know are, and oh yeah, this person's like that, and they do this, and they have kids, and they do these things. So it can really help now. So when some crisis happens, you're not going to be, it's going to be much easier to kind of deal with that. Or even when politics don't go your way, might have a different attitude about that and say, well, we lose sometimes. I don't need to, throw fire onto this, throw gasoline on this fire. We need to do whatever we need to do in our coalition, maybe learn more, whatever it is. And so you have a little bit different reaction to things as well. So that's what was one of the big things about this event, is that getting to see all the people out there working on this stuff, and finding out other things too, like people are doing media. There's a whole creative side where folks are really, and that's the place where we're weakest, as this movement. Like the language is weird and it's not well known, and there
Mhm.
isn't a nice uh, sort of buzzword. But there are people working on that kind of thing. So I mean, I could see that happening. I think like the Us United group. I think that's a much easier thing to think about than sort of the bridging movement and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I think you're seeing these kinds of efforts where people are sort of bringing art to it and bringing maybe some of the places where all of us academic nerds aren't necessarily really great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The kind of the meme game and the narrative building game, that whole side of things is just obviously always been important, and especially important in the social media age. But no, act local. I think I've seen a couple of things. I think Braver Angels. I'm on their newsletter, and I got some email about the area of focus is very much about sort of acting, moving into action, and I forget what something courageous citizenship, I think was the phrase that they were using. I
Hmm.
know, I think crossing party lines, from some discussions I had a while back, but there is like this focus of like, okay, COVID is now sort of in the rearview mirror. Can we do more in-person activities? Can we sort of come back into the real world in real life? And I think that sounds like a very, just for context for anybody who's not sure, the bridging or bridge building kind of movement. It's sort of, I hesitate to call it an industry because I feel like it's the wrong connotation, but I don't have, it's like, I don't want to, it's like a cottage cluster movement and cluster of organizations. Probably most of them sprung up around 2016-ish timeframe, or many of them did. And their basic focus is how like the country's becoming more polarized. People are slotting themselves into left or right and becoming very hardened and digging their heels in terms of their views and their opinions of the other side. Can we create spaces where people at different points in the political spectrum can actually come and talk to each other, have dialogue, and then kind of facilitate some kind of empathy and mutual understanding? That's kind of the the vibe, and the ethos of it. And now what you're saying is that there's more of a focus on not just talking, but let's do projects together. And I think that is something like that, right? What are some of the kinds of projects that people are doing at the local level that you heard about that really stood out?
Well, one group that's doing this in very thoughtful ways, or very, this is they're what's the word I'm looking for, not random ways, like they're really putting effort in, so they're
Yeah.
not trying to scale it gigantic. They're going
Right.
into places with very intentionally, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And that's this group called Rural Renewal. I don't know why I've struggled with rural, but
Yeah.
Urban Rural Action. I'm sorry, Urban Rural Action.
Rural action. Yeah.
And so what they're doing is kind of they go in, they spend time. So like when they go into a place that's and they typically select places that have a really big divide right now. Maybe even it's even gone so far as there's been violence around political violence or
Yeah.
something like that, right? So they're very divided areas, and then so they go in and they first do all this connection work. So they first find people in that area that are already sort of connected in that area, and so then they get associated with them and they learn that area, like what's that area going through and what are their challenges, and then they will assemble a group of people across various spectrums, age and politics and other things, and um, and then they'll try to come up with something to do, and that's the hard part, right? So agreeing on what to do. So they go through this whole effort. They have a whole process that takes months. You don't go in for a weekend and do one workshop. This takes quite a while, and then now they've come up with the thing they can all agree on, or there's enough of a coalition to agree on this is the thing we want to do together. And so some of those have been things like community farming, like a community farm for the area, and things like that. And they're doing this in selected cities, so they're not sort of going, they're not everywhere in the world, but they're going in places that are particularly divided and going through this. And that's one example. You may know about Rich Harwood and the Harwood Institute. They do this around the country. It's things like that around the country as well, where they go into an area that's divided and do a similar thing where they try to they bring people together to what are these big problems that we agree we want to solve. This one we're so divided on, you know what, we don't have to do that one right now. Like there's these other ones that
Mm. Yeah.
that we can focus on now, that we can come to some idea of a solution or a task we want to do with that.
Yeah.
And then they do the hard work to really kind of execute that. So there's movements like that going on out there. And as you noted, Braver Angels has done this pivot towards action as well. So
Yeah.
they're doing similar kinds of things
Yeah.
beyond the conversation.
So you mentioned community farming. What are some of the other things that y- you heard that, even a very divided population is able to sort of come together, agree on, and actually move forward on? What are some of the kinds of projects? Standing up
Some of Some have
hospitals.
been around things like crime and police,
Yeah.
community police relations,
Okay.
things like that,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it's very divided on those things,
Totally.
and working on that and bringing the parties from all sides into that,
Yeah.
and getting them to work together. So there's quite a few different things, and that's one thing about urban rural actions, and they're not the only one, but just in their case, like
Yeah.
they don't have a one set plan, like a program that, oh, we're going to go in and solve this kind of problem. They go
Totally.
figure out what's going on in that community first, and then have a one-off way to do that based
Yeah.
on the resources,
Yeah.
and the problems in that community.
So I'm really curious. That's like really, I think it's a great model, and I'm curious how it works. But scrolling through your site a little bit earlier, and I think you interviewed somebody from urban rural. Is it Action? Urban Rural Action?
Yeah,
Yeah.
action. Yeah.
So based on that conversation and sort of what you learned, like how does it, like do they have somebody who's like trained at some central level that they then send into the town and it's like their job to like now figure it out? Or do they like connect with somebody in the town, form a relationship, and then that becomes their liaison? Like how do they get that process started?
Yeah, I'm going to do my best because I might not get
Yeah.
it 100% right.
Yeah.
But yeah, they basically have, sort of their on staff leaders, and
Yeah.
a lot of programs and information workshops and things like that about how to communicate and how to do some of these basic steps.
Yeah.
So then, yeah, they will send in a team of their sort of, universal folks that then go in and make these connections, figure out who the community leaders are, across these different spectrums of interests, and then go from there to form. And what they like to do is form this idea of a hub. So then that community might be able to do more than one project, plus maybe cover a broader geographic area. And I might be getting some of that wrong, but I think that's pretty close to what they're trying to do. And then, like I say, they spend a fair bit of time there. This is a commitment people make. People make like a 9-month commitment
Yeah.
if they're going to get involved in this.
Yeah. And I mean, in the way things happen, even 9 months is, you may probably need more than that to really like create a transformation. So that's amazing. So it's like, I mean, where my mind went, I don't want to, I'm not trying to make fun or anything, but it's like a team of like Jedi Masters shows up into a town and sort of starts to like figure out, how can things be raised to, how can things be uplifted here? How can we bring people together to actually solve local problems instead of just kind of getting mad at what their phone is showing them all day, right?
Right, and that's a lot. You hear a lot of this talk of sort of getting off the couch and trying to solve the world's problems by clicking like, or going to your doorstep. Like
Yeah.
it's not always a gigantic
Yeah.
not every, we don't have to go and try to solve it. Even for my whole community, it might be my neighborhood, it might be my
Yeah.
front door. It's these can be smaller things.
Totally. I mean, this is something I think about quite a bit. It's like, obviously, you're participants in a democracy. You want to have some awareness of the national level, even the geopolitical level, because you have to, foreign policy is important. It affects our lives. We have to vote on it. But there's definitely like a healthy ratio of where you allocate your attention. And my intuition says the brunt of it, unless you are a leader of a large organization or aspiring for some kind of political office or something, like unless you're like in a certain slots in society where maybe your attention has to be allocated differently. Like for somebody who's like living their life in their community, trying to raise a family, etc., like probably the brunt of your attention should be more local. Like if we were spending where you can have a greater impact, right? Like if we were spending a majority of our time paying attention to like local issues and some portion paying attention to bigger issues so that we can participate rather than paying all of our attention on the big issues and paying almost no attention to the local issues, like that first one would probably lead to a more balanced kind of situation. And I think what maybe you heard about this also in your conversations, like when you actually try to like make things happen in the real world, you realize like the challenge of actually doing that, right? Like theoretically, everything can sound amazing, and
Right.
it can almost seem obvious what the right way forward is if you've like immersed yourself in a worldview, you're in some online echo chamber, and you're just in the theory. It's like obviously whatever, whatever who your preferred political program is, obviously that's the right thing to do. And there's probably a lot of merit to it, but when you actually try to have an idea and make contact with reality, then you then you realize like what it actually takes to get something done, which probably
Yeah.
moderates people,
And
moderates.
you also learn that there's more to this issue than your superficial
Right.
black and white view of it.
Totally. Totally.
There's always trade-offs.
Yeah, yeah. It's like there's way more to reality than what you think. Like you might think your model has it all, but there's like so much more. But it's hard. I'm also sort of empathetic. It's like it's hard to understand that, I think, until you really try to go out in the world and do something. Because like in your mind, it seems like you have a lot of things figured out. How much more could there really be? That
Right.
could, if somebody tries to suggest that to you, you might think, oh, they're just trying to like slow me down or obfuscate me or makes what's simple sound complicated and use that as like a shield, which some people also do, right? They try to use complexity as a shield. But anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Well,
But
and I also want to say that, like in terms of like you were talking about, if unless you're trying to do political office, some larger thing, or you're a member of a large organization,
yeah,
you aren't necessarily going to have that much big picture impact. But
yeah,
I want to say that we sometimes forget that, I think when we talk about civic action, a lot of times we think that means voting, of course, but also, maybe campaigning or being an activist or going to rallies. But a lot of other things are civic action, like if you're strengthening the relationships in your neighborhood, that's a
totally.
civic action. If you're holding potlucks, that's a civic action. If you have a library box, down your street, those are all things that strengthen your community and our democracy. So, it doesn't always have to be some really grand thing that has a political connotation to it.
Absolutely. In fact, that's like the nuts and bolts of the whole thing, right? There's this sort of in the political theory of America, the sovereignty was given to the people, right? So the people are this sovereign. And if you think of like the people as this collective entity, which is the sovereign of the, society, like that sovereign has certain responsibilities, and that sovereign has to be like internally coordinated. Like people have to like have relationships with each other so that it can perform its function. Does that make sense? This is
100%. Yeah.
in order to actually make sure that the government, which is where all the power is actually working for the people. That sovereign also has to have some coordination among itself so that it can otherwise otherwise the I don't want to sound too cynical, but the political parties or political entities, if there's not unity at that level, at the community level, they can actually work to like compartmentalize you, right? And then form the narrative and kind of that works to their benefit. Let me put it that way. Uh,
Right.
yeah. Very cool. So, anything else you want to mention from what you learned at that event? Anything else that stood out?
Well, there's a lot, but we probably could talk about more stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
It was
Well,
great though. I mean, it was
yeah,
really wonderful to see people in real life and do a thing in real life.
for sure, for sure. Um, so it's been a year since we last spoke. You've done, many more podcasts, spoken with many more people, and various other projects as well, creative projects, media projects. And a lot has happened in the world. So like what have you learned since then? Like how is your thinking? I mean, I don't know how much you remember from the conversation we had a year ago, but ignoring the conversation itself, just in the past 12 to 14 months, how has your thinking evolved or what new things have you learned regarding the outrage industry or polarization in the country, the political situation in the country? Anything, what's top of mind these days?
Well, you know, I I think back to an episode that I spent a long time on. I do some documentaries kind of interspersed with my interview episodes.
Yeah.
And so last year I did a documentary episode called America on the Knife's Edge, sort of talking about how we're in this kind of 50% plus one universe that we're in, and really kind of going through that in a with a lot of experts with a lot of different perspectives on that, and how it's kind of dangerous and it's kind of because what happens is we get in our heads that we're going to do something that's going to flip so many people that we will have some kind of durable, 35-year domination of the other side.
Yeah.
And both sides see the world that way. This idea that we will, when people come around, they just have to come around, and they come around to the right way of thinking, we will dominate, for this long time. And when that doesn't happen, we get really frustrated, we get mad, and we get scared, and we, sometimes overreact, right? And it starts to open the door to these more undemocratic ideas because we're not getting what we want. And I think that's been a message that, I started to give last year, kind of knowing we had a big presidential election coming up, and sort of the environment of that, and people sort of started expressing. I try to interact with and hear from a lot of listeners, and I try to interact with as many as I can, and about what are they thinking, what are they feeling, and that kind of thing. And there was a big sense of kind of you know uh, fear and worry and kind of just concern, many different concerns from sort of all sides, and and so that's been a theme that I started to do a little bit more with the show, a little bit more kind of resilience, because a lot of times people see a show like mine and they think we're only kind of complaining about the media. That's all we do all day. Is the media is all of our problem, or social media is, and that's all we kind of have a show, just complaining about the media. And all of those things are part of this larger problem, right? There, none of these are some magical solution. You can do one thing. So obviously we talk about a lot more than just what's happening in the media. And so I've been spending more energy kind of thinking about how to build resilience, to some of these kind of ideas, and just even building a lens of appreciating the environment we're in and understanding that things aren't always going to go your way. And nobody
Yeah.
likes that. And what are you going to do when they don't go your way? So that was a big theme of trying to really, helping people, or helping, bring experts on, and helping get some ideas of how do we build resilience to the realities of politics.
Yeah.
And so that was what I think was a big theme sort of last year, up to the election, and then of course post-election. And then post-election, we pivoted a little bit more towards, talking about democracy and sort of the realities of how government. And that's not a new thing. We've been doing that, but you could say maybe we talked about it a little bit more. And so there's been a little bit of a pivot towards that, just sort of thinking about democracy and what are the and again, kind of what can, because regular people always want to know what can I do myself? I'm just this person, and I think a lot of people have got become cynical. The whole story, right? We get cynical, and then we get kind of like we disengage, and there's a lot of reasons to be cynical. I get it, right? But if you go that, you don't, it's not going to get any better if you just sit on the couch and be cynical.
Yes. It
So
can always get
I think
worse.
it can always get worse.
Yeah.
So that's been a fair shift of that's been sort of an evolution, I would say, over this past year a little bit. I mean, obviously we're still talking about a lot of the scientific phenomena and things like that, and a lot of the research going on behind some of the things that we see. Spend a little bit more energy on sort of AI and the connection back to social media and some of the other tech, and we've even talked about sort of tech for good. It's not always, I mean, there are ways you could apply this tech for good. So we try to bring those messages out as well. But so that's a relatively new thing. We were talking about it a little bit before, but I want to do even more of that, because I mean, I think AI is going to be a big factor in our lives for a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, we could, we could definitely get into that. I wasn't anticipating getting into that, but we could. But so it sounds like it's been more of a sort of like more of a philosophical year. In a way, it's like not so much focused on the media or on trying to like I think last time we spoke, you were like the impetus to start Outrage Overload is you noticed there was a problem in society with the polarization. You tried to look to the experts to see what they were saying about it. They were saying a lot of great things about it, but it was like they were talking among themselves. And and you thought you could be a channel to like translate that sort of sophisticated academic cutting edge thinking to, a broader mass audience that maybe isn't trained in the
Yeah.
jargon or whatever, right? But now,
And that's still our secret sauce to a degree. I mean, we're still doing that, right?
totally, totally.
That's part of our part of I don't know if I have a
That's the
superpower, maybe
core.
that's
That's
it,
the
right?
core of it. Yeah, yeah. That's no, that's still the core. But in terms of like thematic focus, it's been about kind of philosophically understanding democracy and how to relate to democracy, how to actually participate intelligently in a democracy in a mature kind of participation with democracy, rather than maybe a sort of immature way, which is we see a lot maybe nowadays. So I'd love to get into that, like the two aspects that you like. What have you been discussing about the fundamentals of democracy? Like, what are you thinking about that? If you want to go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is just sort of trying to bring experts on that can, be somebody besides me saying it,
Yeah,
political scientists and others that can kind of just walk us through some of the history of why the country was put together this way and why the government works the way it works,
right.
and then some of those realities of you don't always get what you want because it's hard to do this, and some of it's intentional and things like that. So some of it is just those breakdowns of like how did this evolve to get to this point of how our system of checks and balances works, how our system of getting things done works, what the role of the different parties are, including the official government roles, but also the fourth estate and the populace and these other things that were all part of this, as
When
we
you
were
say
sort of saying
parties,
before.
when you say parties, you don't mean Republican, Democrat, or you do? What the role of the different parties are?
Oh, I'm sorry, no, the role of the different parts of government. I'm
Parts.
sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so the branches of government, and
Yeah.
also, but then there's other pieces that are sort of sub branches within. We learned a
Yeah.
lot about the federal bureaucracy in the last the 12 months, right?
Deep state.
Yeah, the deep state, whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah.
But we learned about that role and how that's evolved.
Yes.
That and
Yes.
why that came about, and these kind of things, and what its purpose is, and things like that.
Mm.
So we talk about these kind of things because some of it, I think civics is not, you know, maybe as much of a subject, and especially from a practical sense, right? It's you know, think of it in the abstract, but now it's affecting our lives. So let's really think about those basic civics questions, and then beyond, a little bit beyond that. So things like, what is the how does some of these details, like we've talked about, how would a Supreme Court, the judicial branch and the executive branch, I had an expert on, a scholar, a constitutional scholar, about that, talking about, if it comes to head, this is sort of new territory for us. And their phrase was sort of like, this would be like two suns colliding if the judicial branch and the executive branch actually sort of go toe to toe at some point. And I think this is something that John Roberts is really working to avoid, right? But things
What do you
like
mean
that.
go toe to toe, and in what way?
Well, if let's say an executive decides to
Oh, yes. Yes.
not obey court orders,
Right.
and
Right.
how would the court go about enforcing
Yes.
those, and what's that start to look like? And this is like a internal government sort of civil war practically,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Two very big power pieces, and then we talk about how Congress has sort of basically given up their role, like they've acquiesced, and just they don't have the role they're supposed to have by the Constitution. They're sort of not doing anymore, and we are sort of okay with it, right? And these are the kind of things that if we understood it better, we might try to get Congress to take their power back.
Yes.
Because that's not a Democrat or Republican thing, by the way. That's been going on for decades.
Yeah, yeah. No, these tussles are definitely happening. I mean, as you're talking about the judicial and the white and the executive going toe to toe, I mean, that has happened in history, but each time it's been like tumultuous. Like, right? I mean, you go all the way back to one of the most there's a great talk. I don't know if you've seen this. I'm going to send it to you though. It's a fantastic talk by Stephen Breyer, who's a former justice that he gave at Yale several years ago, over a decade ago, where he basically literally talks about this, that there are like the balance of powers is very delicately held together, and actually the Supreme Court lacks enforcement mechanisms of its own. And so what
Right.
does it do when the other branches don't choose to enforce its rulings? Like, how does that, what happens, right? And then he goes through kind of a history of three episodes where that happened and how it was managed differently. And the first one was the Marbury versus Madison case. I don't know if how you're familiar with that. Yeah. And what really shocked me about that is the people who were threatening the system were Thomas Jefferson and John Adams in a way. Like it was their feud. Like these are the guys who were involved
Right.
in setting the thing up, and now they're the ones who are like taking it to the brink. And then
Right.
the Chief Justice who was there at the time, I think he was also a robber, so I'm forgetting, but he sort of very cleverly did a kind of judo move that actually gave Supreme Court the power of judicial review, which wasn't actually given to it in the technically in the Constitution. But anyway, that there's a whole complex story there. And then the second story that Justice Breyer talks about is when Andrew Jackson refused to follow a court order related to, I think it was the Cherokee. I don't know if I'm getting it right, but there was a certain Native American tribe in Georgia. Their land, the treaty was being violated because there was gold on that land. Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. I think it was something along the lines of the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now he can go enforce it. Jackson literally said that. And then that literally led to the Trail of Tears. But then what happened is other states saw that Jackson didn't follow a Supreme Court ruling. So then they were like, why do we need to follow the system if he doesn't have to, right? And then there's some states like refused to pay their taxes to the federal government. That created a whole problem. Jackson had to send the troops down there and led to another problem. And then that was navigated. And then the last one was the Brown v. Board of Ed. The Supreme Court had to issue the ruling multiple times before it was actually followed. And Eisenhower finally sort of followed through and made sure it was enforced, et cetera. So each episode was like a serious crisis moment. And it's kind of like you hope people's wiser angels prevail. And when they don't, I'm going off on a little bit of a rant here, but I really love this talk. I hope it's interesting. I'll definitely send it to you. In the Jackson case, for example, when the balance of powers isn't upheld, right? When the Supreme Court, let's say, passes a ruling and then the executive just refuses to follow it, what it does is it leads to a disintegration of other people's willingness to participate in the system. So in a way, when I heard that talk, I was like, oh, there's a hidden balancing mechanism here which is not laid out, but it's like if one entity refuses to follow its purpose, other people will just defect from the system. And then you put the whole broader system at jeopardy. And so that is a kind of a hidden balancing mechanism. I don't know if that 100% makes sense, but when Jackson refused to execute the Supreme Court's ruling there, other states just said, okay, then we won't pay taxes or something like that happened, right? So there are like hidden balancing things like that, but it's all held together by people actually choosing to follow the process and follow the spirit of the process. Otherwise, it can fall apart. Anyway, that was my little rant.
Well,
Um,
and
yeah.
talking about that idea is when one, like when one person say ignores the court order or whatever, that makes other people say, well, I can do it too. I
Mhm.
mean, there's similar things like that with us and democracy as well.
Yeah.
Um, Andrea Shedler was actually like episode 37, so it was quite a long time ago. But that also informed the knife edge episode I was talking about because this idea that we all these democratic things are really sort of based on trust. They're based
Yeah.
on you complying with it, right?
Yeah.
So like if the Supreme Court's we trust the Supreme Court unless we think they're a bunch of hacks. We
Yeah.
trust
Exactly. Exactly.
and it's just and what happens then is it can all kind of spiral out of control
Totally.
as if you don't if everyone sort of stops believing in these things are what they were sort of philosophically laid down to be.
Totally.
And so yeah, and then that also there's also kind of relation to that in Leah Braley's work, kind of talking about how these misperceptions also create problems like that too, because we if we think the other side might do something undemocratic, we might do something undemocratic first,
Yes.
right? And it starts to sound more reasonable, even if they haven't really done it. And even if when you actually look at the numbers, they're about as likely to do it as you are, which is not very likely, by the way. But these misperceptions, we've been told they're terrible and they want to do these bad things. And so if we believe they're ready to do a bad thing, we might do a bad thing first.
Yeah. 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 Preventative, like a preventative strike kind of a thing.
And I
Um,
think you're seeing that a little bit with the temperature rising with things like the redistricting and things like that, right? So,
yeah.
I mean, these are concerning things that are happening.
Totally. So when you have experts on to talk about this, what kind of reaction are you getting from from your listeners? Are people are you freaking people out? Are people aware of this and they're like, okay, this is interesting, or are people like maybe I can make the question a little bit broader and you can share, your specific audience's reactions, but just your sense of like how aware do you think the population is about the delicateness of this thing? Do you know what I mean? Because like, growing up, I was like, this thing is solid. I mean, it's not a conscious
Right.
thought that I have,
Right.
but I was like, what could go wrong with this thing? Like, okay, there will be differences of opinion. Even as a kid, it's like, okay, but like the system is solid, right? Like, and it wasn't just me, 10-year-old, 11-year-old Nimayi walking like around. It was like Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. Like we figured it out. We figured out the right system, and you don't maybe really appreciate how delicate it is, and that there have been periods in history where it was brought to the brink in various different ways. There were constitutional crises. So how aware do you think of people are generally about the delicateness of the thing, and what kind of reaction did you get from having these people on?
Well, what I first want to say to that is like, one thing I try to do with my show is lower the temperature. So I do try to
Yeah.
bring like a realistic perspective.
Right.
Sometimes when we're kind of spun up about a thing, I try to bring on
Yeah.
experts that can sort of, have maybe a hopeful message or at least a sort of clarifying message about that,
Yeah.
this and that. And I usually, obviously, you probably know, I always try to kind of end on some kind of a hopeful note because sometimes
Yeah.
the researchers have more problem statement and less solution.
Yeah.
But I try to do that, and it doesn't always work, right? Sometimes it doesn't work, but we're often trying to do that, like just sort of explain how this really works, and what the real threats are. And I will say that. And so generally that's a big factor. So we had a episode one. This brings me to mind a couple of episodes. One was last year when there was a lot going on with Project 2025 was in the news, and he on Trump's own website he had the thing he called Agenda 47, which was a smaller sort of subset, sort of like a subset of Project 2020 2025. And if you recall, then he denied he knew anything about Project 2025 and said it wasn't going to do anything, didn't know anything about it, and had nothing to do with it. But he did have on his website this Agenda 47 thing. So what I did then is again to kind of like say, well, what is really in this thing, and what might happen here. I brought on a couple of political scientists,
Yeah.
and we went through. We only could pick a few because we're going more in depth. We went in through a few of the larger things that he had sort of threatened with Agenda 47,
Right.
and of course at that time trying to say, well, what might that really look like when we implement it, and we kind of talked about one of them was sort of the federal bureaucracy issue. One was, and so we sort of tried to lay out, or the political scientists I hadn't tried to lay it out that don't overreact too much. It's going to be fought in courts, and he may not, he will be constrained by by our system of checks and balances, right? And then this year, because that was like over a year ago, I had that same political scientist back, not to like sort of call him out that, hey, dude, you got this wrong, but just to say, so how do things look compared to what we said a year ago and how it's playing out, and he was like, I'm concerned. I mean, this has not, some of the things that the courts have not quite been able to do what we talked about, and he's moved ahead on things that are either extra legal or on the fringe and things like that. So
Yeah.
so again, I'm not trying to freak people out. We're just trying to sort of explain what's really happening. But he still basically tried to, was basically saying, you still have the voters, you still have the vote. He still believes, he was confident that the 2026 elections will be, accurately counted.
Yeah.
Now we do have the gerrymandering issue to think about, but he doesn't think that there will be, sort of widespread, voter suppression
Mhm.
or just flat out, sort of stealing the election kind of stuff, or preventing people from voting
Mhm.
and real nefarious stuff.
Mhm.
He's confident that the 2026 election will happen, and there'll be opportunities for the American people to have their voice.
Right.
But it's interesting when we try to bring up those topics that I will say that this administration has even people that were really very much, they weren't necessarily Trump supporters, but they lean right, and they have very strong, and I am too. I'm very, like you're saying, I'm very pro America. I think it's great. I think our systems are good, and I think they are strong. I would I was on that same boat that these systems are strong. We have ways of keeping things under control. And Trump has pushed those levers pretty far.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. It's challenging, and I mean, this might take us off into a tangent because I understand the argument of like, so there's this argument on the other side of like the executive has actually been drained of its rightful power, right?
Right. Right.
That
Yep.
through a kind of sneaky decades-long process, the executive is supposed to control the executive branch, and anything that stops the executive from just having pretty much authoritarian control over the executive branch makes them
Right.
not the executive branch. They can't execute, right? And so there's a strong attitude on it. But yeah, it's
And this Supreme Court is fairly sympathetic to that
yeah,
position.
yeah. Absolutely. So I it's a challenging debate, but I mean,
Right. And it's a fair argument. You can make
yeah,
that argument.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, and the world we're in now, government, how the government is structured now,
Yeah,
when people always kind of, oh, what would the framers think and this kind of stuff. We have to realize that the world we're in now is so different as our government is built. It has so many departments, and there's so much in the executive department
yeah,
now that wasn't there. Like none of that stuff was there. There was no national FBI type thing. There was marshals, and that was about it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
there was a lot less government.
yeah.
So it's a different world we're in now.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and so trying to even say, oh, the framers wouldn't have wanted this is kind of hard in the context we live in now. There was no federal bureaucracy
Totally.
like there is.
Totally. Yeah, you really have to try to understand the spirit and then see how does that actually apply in the modern context. We have like multiple intelligence agencies. Some of them are focused internally, some of them externally. It's like it's a different world, and it's the economy is more complex. Yes. Did you want to talk a little bit when you mentioned how the sort of intellectuals are very uh, focused on the I heard this phrase recently, admiring the problem. I had never heard that before. I was like, yes, that that explains me probably in many ways also. Like
Right. Well, we
it's
can all do that. We're
one
all
of
good at
the
that.
yeah, it's just like all the nuances and complexities of the problem. But when you try to be able to add that hopeful tone, like where do you go to find that like, okay, yes, the system is delicate. It requires wise leadership who follow the spirit of the thinking behind it. It's being strained right now pretty significantly. Where do you go to like figure out, okay, like where is the hopefulness in this?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I've been lucky enough to really establish some great relationships with a wide array of experts, and that'll actually take my email and really respond and like talk to dumb old me,
Yeah,
and so that's been great. So you have a lot of different experts I can turn to, and I guess in general, I would say the political scientists that focus on the U.S., not so much the ones that focus on comparative um,
yeah,
analysis around the world. They're the ones who, really have a great history and understanding and appreciation for sort of Madison and all the and all Madisonian democracy,
yeah,
and that's super helpful to return to them to say, what does this look like? Where are we? And
yeah.
try to figure out, bring some reality into it. Am I jumping off a cliff here for no reason? What's happening?
Right.
So that's one of the areas that tend to usually have some positive
Mhm.
thinking about this, and just some clarity on everything.
Mhm.
The other area are these practitioners, right? The ones that are out in the sort of boots on the ground, talking and acting and out in the real life, and giving a much clearer picture, adding clarity to our caricatures of our political opponents, right? And,
Absolutely.
and showing that there's so much complexity and so much nuance in all that. And I think we do have some exceptions in the academic world as well, right? I mean, if you look at like the work James Fishkin has been doing for decades with kind of deliberation and trying to get this idea of deliberative democracy off the ground,
Yeah.
and he's had more success, frankly, in other countries so far. But they've been doing some, and it really shows that anyone, like, we have the ability to deliberate if when the circumstances are there for it, right? When the conditions exist, and creating those conditions is what we have to do, because once we do start to see the complexity and the real trade-offs of these solutions, and we can separate it from sort of ideological ideas, then we can actually start to appreciate. And what we see is that people, A can talk to each other when you really have the information and have the setting right. So you can have these dialogues that aren't just spun out of control rage fights, but also we begin to appreciate things like we were said in the beginning, that real world problems are harder to fix and all have trade-offs. And then we're sort of now we're in the area where it matters, where we can start to sort of have our conversations around those trade-offs,
Yeah.
and not about ideology anymore,
Right.
as much anyway. I mean, we still might have some moral things around some of these trade-offs that can come into play, of course, but when we appreciate the nuance of it, and what we find in the real problems that we have, most of them don't have a gigantic moral piece to them, right? We might have attached one to them because our party says this and the other party says that, so therefore it must be the right thing. But um, in real life, they don't have a lot of our deep-seated sort of moral fabric attached to it. And and then there's always those ones that do. They can come back around too. But there's so many things we could work on that we can pretty much avoid that as a big part of it. Like we can just start looking at those trade-offs and come up with a coalition that says we can live with these trade-offs.
Yeah.
Because you're never going to find a solution that's going to be perfect for everyone.
Right, right. It's often helpful to try to get as quickly as possible into, okay, this is what you want to do, but how will you implement it? Like when you force people to actually articulate the how rather than the what or the why, that's when you're forcing their brain to grapple with these trade-offs, right? So
Right, but they have to be well informed too. I mean, this is part of this is what one of the challenges of like the work James Fishkin is doing and others as well. But this, that there's a lot of effort put into really understanding these problems and what the solutions look like and what the trade-offs of those proposed solutions are.
yeah,
That has to go into that first, because you have to have you can't kind of go into this with one person with some Fox News talking points and the other person with some MSNBC talking points and think you're going to get
right,
anywhere. You're going to have to actually get down into the reality
yeah,
of what is really involved in this issue.
right.
Um, and there's some other work talking. This triggered for me when you were talking about thinking about these solutions. Is there's some other work that shows that we start to change our priorities based on the ideological connection of solutions. So once an ideological solution gets attached to a problem, we then either raise the significance of that problem or lower it depending on how much we like the solution. So we have to be careful of that as well.
Could you give an example of that process just so like it locks in for people? Like like how,
Probably COVID is one of the
yeah,
easiest ones to think about.
yeah,
Before, in the early parts of COVID, if you look at when you poll people, we were all about equally concerned about it. We were equally concerned about getting sick and
right.
these kind of things. But once certain solutions got attached to it, now we lowered our priority on what we were concerned about, or raised it based on how those solutions seem to be attached to an ideology.
Also, like our concern about COVID itself went up or down based on the
Yes.
solutions that were being, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's gnarly.
And you see that with environmental stuff as well, right? That
Right.
happens with the
Yes.
environmental stuff.
Right. Hmm. Interesting. I want to get a quick time check before I move on. How much time do you have?
It's a good question. I do have a no. I think I'm good, but yeah, I'm good. Yeah, I'm good.
Good.
I don't
Yeah.
have to do anything for. Yeah, I'm good for a while.
I wanted to get into one thing before we get into the story of Outrage Overload, if that's okay. Which is well, quickly, any thoughts on that? That's a really gnarly problem that you just laid out. I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about it, but where and it all happens subconsciously. We talked a lot about this a lot in our last conversation about it. It's just like an awareness problem at some level. Like we don't even know what our deep subconscious conditioning is like even causing us to think or do, right? And this whole thing of like, if you don't like the solution, you actually reprioritize the problem. That's not, maybe people aren't even like consciously making that decision. It's something in them knows that if I maintain a high priority here, then I'll have to like agree with the solution. I don't want to do that. So I'll deprioritize the problem, which is like a really irrational move in when you think about it.
Right.
And it just a quick,
Depends on how you define rational, right?
yeah, yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, yeah. If the other side gets a win, that's irrational, you know. Um, uh, But any thoughts on how what a person can do to like make to catch themselves in the act on that front? Like any thinking on that?
Yeah, it's really hard. It is really
Yeah,
hard because there's so many, like you say, a lot of it's subconscious and a lot of it is also even the part about sort of I have to be a good member of my tribe is
yeah,
such a piece that we don't know we're doing. Like we have such a good narrator in our head that tells us
yeah,
we're making these super rational
yeah,
decisions
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
all. So it is really hard, but a lot of it is just that sort of asking yourself some of these questions, like
Yeah.
you know. And they're hard because it's just destabilizing sometimes to go get the answer to some of those questions, right? And so it can be difficult. But often, I think sometimes you're more scared of finding that contrary information than you need to be. Like
Yes.
sometimes it's
Yes.
not as bad as you thought to understand the contrary information.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, there's like yeah, there's probably genuine fear of even the thought of let me try to be empathetic to the opposite point of view because again, I think we've talked about it. Like I might agree with them, and then what do I do with me? My identity, etc. It's tough. I guess if you can create spaces that's encouraged and people are made to feel confident they won't be demonized for that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
is
that's a big part of it.
yeah. Um, So you mentioned that so the trying to understand democracy a little more deeply is one thing, and the other thing was earlier around the election time last year, helping people sort of come to terms with the fact that democracy means things always won't go my way. And also this dynamic of each party seems to be locked in this mindset of let me just get that 50 plus, it's sometimes not even 50 plus one, it's like 50 plus 0.03 or zero point 0.3,
Right.
50 plus 0.3%. And then I will have the mandate to do sweeping social change, and we obviously that we talked about the electoral mandate concept also last time, how having 51% of the vote versus 60% of the vote versus 68% of the vote, it means you're empowered to do different things, right? Um, so just a little bit curious, like I'd love to know, a little bit about how those conversations went, how you tried to like discuss with people and sensitize people to this thing of like, democracy means I don't always get my way. That's the tax we pay for being the sovereign, having the ability to vote and have our representatives and not be ruled over by somebody, right? Um, uh, that's one thing. And then I'm also curious, just to put you on the hot seat. We've been talking for a while, so I wore you down. Now I'm going to put you on the hot seat. This is my strength. Like in the environment we live in today, you're a politician, you come up through one of these parties because a third party doesn't seem to be happening. It's not a viable, well, at least it's not happening right now. Whether it's viable or not, people aren't even trying, right? Um, and so you come up through one of these parties, you're kind of in that party dynamic. You got 51% of the vote. There's all these pressures. Like, how would you actually govern wisely with 51% of the vote today, given the realities of political dynamics in the world today? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you have any thoughts on that, and then we can move to the story of Outrage Overload. We can reminisce a little. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I definitely have empathy for them. I maybe sympathy even, although they made the choice,
They
right?
made the choice, right? You made your bed.
But yeah, I mean, you know, if we talk about, people are brave to do this and do that, a bravery piece is, are you brave enough to sort of attempt to build a coalition
Yeah.
and work across the aisle and all this kind of language that we use, right? And because that takes the most bravery of anything right now, because that's the most likely to get you primaried or all these other things, right? So, so it's hard. I get it. I get why, I mean, it's a legitimate strategy. If you think of the political climate today, it's a legitimate strategy to anger half the nation, right? Because you
Yeah.
get turnout on your side. Um, we know it works. I mean, we've got a lot of examples of this. So, and there's also the bunch of problems with the safe states and all safe districts and all that. That creates more extremism because now it's hard to win a safe district if you're not extreme enough. This kind of thing. So
Yeah.
it is really challenging. But I mean that's the push that I would do. Like I would hope that you could find the bravery because if you don't build those coalitions, then your 50% plus one could go either way next time, right? So you can't do anything lasting. And this is the world we're in now, right? Everything is a pendulum swing. We get, the president comes in, does some executive orders, the next government comes in and reverses it all, and we never get anywhere, right? We just keep going back and forth. And so unless you're willing to start building those coalitions where you can find, and the thing is, it's so funny about these stats. There are issues where there's like insane approval, right? I mean, it's like there's 60-70% approval, which is, like you said, kind of ridiculous. We don't
Yes.
see that in elections very
Yeah.
often.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't really go after that. And like, okay,
Yeah.
let's do that. The American people tell us this is
Yeah.
like 70% approval.
Yeah.
Why aren't we doing that? But we
Yeah.
can't, those politicians can't because it's maybe not acceptable in their ideology, in their
Mhm.
ideological sphere.
Mm. Yeah, that's really because when you were talking about the urban rural action, it's tough for me to say also. Urban rural, a lot of R's.
Yeah.
Uh, Urban rural action. It's like they go into some of the most polarized communities in the country, and they're actually able to find issues that a bunch of people are able to get together on and actually work on. Actually like invest their free time into together. So isn't that kind of like a metaphor probably extends up to the national level? And there are probably policies that 70-80% of people can get behind. Maybe if you don't have a strong electoral mandate, maybe you should focus on those kinds of things. But then you're saying that may run into ideological challenges and certain voices in
In,
your party may. Yeah. So bravery, courage is the key. It's needed.
well, and I hope that, some of what we're seeing now will empower, this independent voter a little bit more, right? I mean, they've always been flagged as like the problem, they're the spoiler, they're all these other things. They're the low information voter and stuff, because they really are the ones deciding a lot of these elections now,
Yeah.
particularly some of these national elections. But even locally, I mean, they're the biggest majority are these people that declare themselves as independent. Now, we know that they often vote one way or the other, but they obviously are not on board with that party enough to want that label. And
Yeah.
so somehow there's opportunity there, and maybe we'll see more of that. And it's where it won't be so socially unacceptable to be an independent and actually vote independent, cross ticket, all this kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's probably the savior, the thing that's going to start pulling these parties, back to some sanity, is if we start to see more of that, where these independents assert their power.
Yeah, yeah. In a heavily polarized system, like situation, a few votes that are truly independent actually have enormous leverage, right? So that is an interesting possibility within the current framework. But we'll see, we'll see what happens with that. Great. So you answered well the hot seat.
Well, the main answer is I don't want to be a politician.
Yeah,
I don't envy
I
them, that's for sure.
I don't, yeah, yeah. It's yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's true they made their choice, but also, it is a tough position to be in.
Well, and that said, I mean, there are opportunities locally there again too, right? I mean, you could be town council, you could be school board.
Yeah,
So there are opportunities to do things that
yeah.
don't require that national, sort of exposure.